So we titled this as Access to Opportunity, Transportation Resilience and Recovery. The reason we say access to opportunity is to make the point that transportation per se is not the point. The only reason we have infrastructure, we have cars, railways, boats, all these things, is so that every one of us could have a good access to jobs, to education, to hospital, healthcare. So this is the overall purpose of it, right? Want to really clarify what is success. The success should be defined that every citizen in Ukraine have the opportunity to access those opportunities, right? This lecture is organized by the MIT Department of Urban Studies Planning, along with MIT Mobile Initiative. And I'm really thankful for Professor Carl Kim from University of Hawaii and Dr. Nick Karras from Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, particularly the Internet Transport Forum, to join us. So as first thing, I really want to warm up the audience a little bit so we know each other better. If you don't mind, in the chat, I will invite everybody to type your name, your role, your organization, and city. So at least the audience knows, the speaker knows who's him, give some context here, right? So I'll maybe take 30 seconds. I will say, so I'm Jinhua Zhao from MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I will invite my Ukraine audience to add yours as well, so we know who's in the audience here. Again, I invite our Ukraine colleagues to type your name, your role, your organization, and the city in the chat, if you can. Thank you. Arena and Alona, thank you. Special development.
У нас тут близько 70 представників громад. І це громади всі, які дійсно постраждали від війни. І вони мають різні повноваження і статус, але вони всі включені в управління містом. І ми не всі володіємо добре англійською мовою, але дуже включені і дуже раді чути вас в цьому процесі.
Thank you. Yeah, we saw many of the colleagues already typed in your roles, etc. This is very helpful, so we know the context of the colleagues there. Yeah, thank you. Please keep doing that. I just see that Arena, the chief architect, Victor Chernihiv from community village head. Thank you. Yeah, please keep doing that. So I'll go back to the station there. As Andrew said, this is the first of a series of lectures we prepared. The first one, we start from transportation and infrastructure. The second will be given by Professor Albert Said on basics of urban and housing economics in post-disaster and reconstruction. And the third one is on the economics of a master planning, a major development and redevelopment projects. The fourth one by Timothy Sturgeon from the MIT Industrial Performance Center on reintegrating Ukraine's software industry into the global value chain. The lecture 5 by Elizabeth Reynolds, who's a professor of practice at MIT on industrial transformation in the new era of manufacturing. And the last one by Professor Jeffrey Levin on revitalizing main streets as small town economic development strategy. So that's the 6 lectures that we prepared as a whole package here. So let me say a few words about the MIT Mobility Initiative. That's a global platform aimed to accelerate the safe, clean, and inclusive mobility system. Safe, clean, and inclusive, that captures the 3 main objectives of the modern definition of success in transportation and infrastructure. We do that through research, education, entrepreneurship, and engagement. Today, I really want to emphasize the engagement. I think this seminar series is actually a great example to show MIT's willingness to engage the broader community, the industry, in this case, the Ukrainian cities and the community. So we'll have 2 main speakers, presentations. The first one by Nick Karros, talk about developing policy pathways for the recovery of Ukraine's transport sector, based on his research at the International Transportation Forum. And second one by Professor Carl Kim, talk about the challenges of building back better and the disaster recovery. He's the director of the graduate program on disaster management and humanitarian assistance, and also the executive director from the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. So I think both could be a fitting topic for today's discussion. So without further ado, let me give the forum to Dr. Nick Harris.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Jinhua. Let me share my screen. All right, so everyone can see my slides?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
good. Yes.
Thank you. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the work that I've been doing, advising the Ukrainian national government, including Ukrainian Railways and the Ministry for Restoration, on how to develop policy pathways for the recovery of Ukraine's transport sector. And this is really looking at strategies for, connecting communities across Ukraine with both freight and passenger transport. And I'll explain a little bit why that's important for community development, and then the procedure by which these strategies get developed, so that hopefully you have a better understanding of how that ultimately works at the national level. But first, before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the motivation for why we actually need to engage in this sort of exercise, and why we can't just use the sort of typical tools that have been used in the past for transport development across the world. And now, of course, Ukraine is facing extraordinary challenges in its transport sector. There's the damage from the war. There's been reduced capacity on road and rail links, links that have been destroyed completely, illegal occupations, blockades. And the World Bank estimates that about $74 billion is needed for complete recovery of the transport sector. So that just the scope of the challenge is really enormous. But if that wasn't enough, there's a number of other different things happening all at the same time. So there's the reorientation of trade from the eastern and northern borders to the western borders and the southern ports on the Black Sea. There's challenges related to the rail gauge, where the Ukraine's railroads, the gauge of the railroads don't match the railroads in the EU. There's also just been long-term underinvestment in the rail sector particularly, but also in the road sector, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's just the challenge of private sector capacity. So any country would be facing, an enormous pressure to be able to handle some of these challenges, but that's no different in Ukraine. Just the enormous volume of work, this $74 billion in recovery needs, and the challenges around workforce availability and modernization of infrastructure and operations. All of these together, creates what's really sort of an unprecedented level of difficulty. But I'm happy to say there's also a lot of opportunities. So we've seen, an outpouring of support from Ukraine's allies, a huge amount of interest in funding restoration of the transport sector, coming from things like the EU, other bilateral and multilateral loans, foreign aid, public-private partnerships, and not just on funding and resources, but there's also been a lot of international support. So things like the EU solidarity lanes have made it easier for Ukraine to export grain into the European Union. A lot of interest in bilateral cooperation, expertise coming from multilateral organizations like the OECD to be able to help the Ukrainian transport sector get back on its feet after the war. And then, as was mentioned in the introductory remarks, there's also this opportunity to build back better, to not necessarily be constrained by how the system was before, but look at what are all the possible futures and how can we make sure that the final result is a transport system that supports an efficient, sustainable, and prosperous sector for Ukraine. So my brief lecture today will talk a little bit first about the role of transport connectivity in community recovery. And I'll share a few examples of other countries where improving transport connectivity has really led to some positive results for communities across the country. Then I'll highlight some of the specific challenges that are facing the regional freight and passenger transport sectors in Ukraine, using some data that we've collected from the National Ministry for Restoration. I'll talk then about how we actually go about developing a prioritization framework to enable a sustainable recovery. And then finally, I'll wrap up by just sharing a few additional resources for local policymakers that come from my organization, the International Transport Forum. So what is the role of regional transport connectivity? Well, we can say from previous evidence that improving transport connectivity between regions and between cities in the same country can create a number of positive economic externalities. So for one, we know that it generates local economic activity and employment opportunities. It also can help to attract new residents, increasing the total employment pool and the demand for goods and services. Increased transport connectivity also helps to grow domestic and international tourism, increase the competitiveness of local firms by making it easier for them to get their goods and services to their customers. And then finally, it also enhances regional integration by making it easier for people to travel between cities and the cohesiveness of cities within a region. And we can see this from previous examples. So one case study that I thought it would be important to highlight is the example of Poland and just the huge amount of investment that went into the road and rail networks after they joined the EU in 2004. They received over 90 billion euros in financing for transport infrastructure. They increased the lengths of expressways in the country by ninefold. They also experienced a 4 times increase in the length of motorways and modernization of what was already a pretty robust railway network to increase the speeds and the reliability of railway services. And what they found was that these investments all had a positive impact on local wages where the investments occurred, on GDP for the country as a whole, on the employment rate, and on private investment in the cities that were received better transport connections. And you can see here on the right-hand side, this map just shows the increase in access to other parts of the country by these small territorial areas. So in a lot of cases, the sort of dark red colors show that they now have access to 100% more of the country than they did before. So you can really see that this massive investment in transport infrastructure produced access benefits, but also a number of other economic benefits for the regions where the transport infrastructure was improved. And then what I thought might be another relevant example is the case of the Rail Baltica, which is actually an ongoing construction project. And this is replacing former Soviet railways with new European standard gauge railways between the Baltic countries of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. So this is something where to improve the connectivity between Ukraine's Western neighbors and Ukraine, a similar sort of exercise might be necessary, and it's expected to have major economic and social benefits. So the studies that were done of this Rail Baltica corridor were expected to actually increase total GDP across the 3 countries by nearly 1% annually, which is a pretty remarkable achievement. It's also expected to improve environmental sustainability by shifting more passengers to the rail network rather than the road network. It's expected to have positive benefits for labor productivity, tourism, land values along the rail corridor, and the safety of the overall transport system. I think what might be important for Ukraine as well is that it's expected to increase the regional military security by making it easier to transport military vehicles and personnel between the regions, and also leading to greater integration overall between the Baltic countries and their neighbors to the south and the west. And the idea is that this project, which is currently under construction, will be completed by 2030. So this is just another example of a specific project that can lead to enhanced regional economic benefits and improved connectivity between cities within these countries. Now I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that are facing Ukraine's transport sector before I get to the strategies that we can use to try to overcome them. So for regional passenger connectivity, for intercity buses, which can be quite popular, they're often operated by a number of different private operators that can be difficult to coordinate their services to make sure that they're offering, efficient connections for passengers between cities. A lot of the bus fleet has, over the last few years, been transferred to defense purposes and been replaced with used vehicles from abroad that are, less reliable. And so that's another challenge that will have to be overcome. The rail carriages operated by Ukrainian railways are 50 years old on average, and because of that age, fewer and fewer of them are able to remain in service and become available for passenger service. So the capacity of the network is starting to decrease. There's also been a bit of a reorientation of the rail network towards a hub model, where there are fewer long-distance connections between cities across different parts of the country, and rather shifting to services that are focused on a few hub cities that passengers can make a transfer in order to continue on to their final destination. And then finally, for those with mobility issues, the rail stations and the carriages have limited accessibility for wheelchair users, which can be a major challenge. But one thing I'll point to is that the demand, as you can see here on the chart on the right-hand side, has actually gone up over the course of the war, and is now higher than it was in 2021 for intercity passenger rail. So I think this is quite remarkable, and it just shows that there's a strong demand for intercity passenger travel in Ukraine that we expect to continue going forward. Now, on the freight transport side, there's also some major challenges that's being faced, particularly by Ukrainian railways. Nearly 60% of the locomotives that they use to transport freight across the country for imports and for exports are 40 years old or older. And you can see that if the level of investment doesn't change and there's no further refurbishment of the fleet, that even by 2030, over 90% of the total locomotive fleet will be more than 40 years old. So that has all kinds of implications for the reliability of services and just the availability of services and availability of vehicles to transport goods. So this is another major challenge that we're focused on trying to resolve. And then finally, as I implied earlier, Ukraine is going through a major reorientation of the trade of goods with neighboring countries. So you can see this chart here shows the change in export volumes at different border crossings between 2021 and 2023. And it's showing the percentage change here. So the first thing that you'll notice is the green dots on the western border, because there's been a huge surge in exports to EU countries by rail. And what's starting to happen is that these border crossing points are experiencing a lot of congestion, and there's significant delays at the border crossings, making it more difficult and more timely for Ukrainian goods to reach their customers. And then, of course, on the northern and eastern borders, the trade has declined by 100%. There's no more trade happening. And this has a lot of implications for the efficiency of rail services, because a lot of the production centers are located in the east and the southeast of Ukraine. And so now they're also having to travel further to reach their markets because they're trading with Poland and Romania rather than Russia and Belarus. Also, the blockades and the damage to ports like Mariupol and Chernomorsk have, of course, caused significant decreases in the ability to export goods from those ports. So now that we've looked at some of the challenges and we understand a little bit about how regional connectivity can actually improve the economic performance in cities and regions, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we actually can go about planning for that recovery and how regional transport infrastructure will be prioritized in Ukraine going forward. So as I mentioned, hundreds of important infrastructure projects have been identified that will contribute to building back better. But I think the major challenge is really understanding how to prioritize those different projects. There's a lot of funding available and a lot of need for new and refurbished infrastructure. So coming up with a comprehensive methodology that can help make sure that the projects that are selected and funded actually contribute to the goals of Ukraine when it comes to building back better is crucially important. And that's what we've been working on. Ukraine is going through this, massive shift, as I mentioned. And in a lot of cases, there may be two projects where there's competing interests, right? So if you think about just the first two goals that are shown here on the slide, restoration of damaged infrastructure after the war, and better integration with European neighbors to boost trade. Those could easily be in conflict with each other. For a certain amount of funding, perhaps you might be considering rebuilding a railway bridge that was damaged in the eastern part of the country during the war, or perhaps expanding the capacity of a road border crossing to Poland in order to improve the flow of trade and the flow of people between Ukraine and Poland. And so how do you go about exactly choosing which one of those projects is more important and prioritizing that is actually quite a big challenge. And of course, when it comes to transport infrastructure, it's important to think about it as a network, right? So coming up with a list of your top 5 priority projects, one of which is in the Southwest and one is in the Northeast and one is in Kiev. Those put together aren't necessarily going to complement each other and create network benefits. So it's important to work on a prioritization framework that gives you a coherent strategy for overall development, rather than just a ranking of individual projects that might not produce, or might not necessarily maximize benefits to the Ukrainian people. So the way that we are coming up with this prioritization framework is through a 3-step project. Now, the first step is looking at assessing Ukraine's transport sector and identifying what the opportunities are for building back better. And we're doing that by looking at the data that's been made available to us from the Ministry for Restoration and Ukrainian Railways, and then also by talking to stakeholders across Ukraine and understanding what their perspectives are about the future of freight and passenger transport in Ukraine. So in this case, we're talking with people, not just freight operators or railway companies or bus companies, but also labor unions and associations of private sector companies and academic institutions, to make sure that we really understand a broad range of perspectives and can address the needs of everybody when we're prioritizing future development. Then in the second step for this project, we're actually designing the prioritization framework that will incorporate the existing challenges, existing plans, and the future goals that we collected during step 1. And then third, we'll actually go ahead and apply the framework, the prioritization framework, to identify some transport policies that the national government can enact, and also some high-quality corridors that might be, that should be prioritized for future investment. So just to dive into each one of those steps a little bit more closely, step 1 was that comprehensive assessment that I mentioned. So what we're doing now is reviewing the previous conditions, the effects of the war, and ongoing recovery efforts, and how they impact Ukraine's transport sector. And then, as I mentioned, we're also engaging with stakeholders to identify national goals and just understanding what exactly is meant when people talk about building back better. And we're also mapping relevant stakeholders and understanding what their roles could be and responsibilities could be when it comes to recovery. Now, we also have some excellent tools at our disposal for looking forward into the future and understanding where the demand for transport might occur. So I wanted to make you all aware that the European Union has actually funded a transport forecasting model for Ukraine that is overseen by the Ministry for Restoration that can actually be used to quantify future infrastructure needs and predict where the greatest demand will be for passenger transport and freight transport going forwards. And these are available to support planning for every region and community in Ukraine. And if you'd like to know more about that, please feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with the people who own this model. Then we actually go about developing the tailored prioritization approach. So this type of tailored prioritization framework can help to identify and rank promising projects based on the goals identified by Ukraine and arrange individual projects into a coherent strategy for sectoral development. So this kind of framework will involve a number of different criteria. Of course, environmental performance is one, the economic benefits would be another, and then some of the costs of the project as well, the overall life cycle cost of the project. And by doing that for every one of the projects that we've identified as possible candidates, then we can see which ones are expected to bring the largest benefits for the least amount of cost and prioritize those for implementation. And then through our project, we'll also be developing a short list of projects and policies using that prioritization framework. And we'll apply that assessment framework to evaluate the different options and select the short, medium, and long-term projects that best support Ukraine's goals. So what we expect from this project is an actionable framework that will be useful for prioritizing future transport infrastructure projects. We hope that the application of this framework will then align those transport projects that are selected for investment with Ukraine's national development goals. And then finally, we hope to leave this project with a series of recommendations for policy pathways that can ultimately contribute to a sustainable and robust transport sector for Ukraine. So that's it for talking about the specific project to prioritize transport infrastructure for regional connectivity in Ukraine. But I also just wanted to highlight a couple of other resources that are available to policymakers that might be even more relevant for you as sort of local policymakers. And I would encourage you to take a look at the ITF website. Here are just some examples, ways that innovation can be leveraged for better rural mobility, ideas around the future of public transport funding and how that can be made more sustainable, and also some specific topical issues like how to support young people and their movement patterns across Ukraine. And finally, we're not just necessarily producing reports, but also statistics. We conduct capacity building workshops to help policymakers with specific issues. We do international coordination like we have been in Ukraine, and also provide tools for sustainable urban mobility plan development, which might be useful for the stakeholders we have today. And I think in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up there. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. And if we have some time, I would be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. This is really helpful and very specific to the Ukraine reality there. So let's pause for a few minutes to invite if any questions and comments from our Ukraine colleagues. Oleg, if you can ask your colleagues to ask questions either in the chat or just already speak up.
В нас є пропозиція, якщо можна, ми зберемо питання і по 2-3 питання направимо до кожного учасника, лектора. Тоді це простіше пояснити, бо щоб не входити в контекст і в інші речі. Але, Нік, я вам дякую за те, що ви робите цю роботу. Проте пам'ятайте, що Україна має один з найбільших логістичних потенціалів в Східній Європі. Це як і добра сторона, і погана, бо одна з причин війни – це якраз зазіхання на нашу спроможність саме логістичну. Власне, тому дуже раді, що ви долучились до цього процесу розуміння цих базових аспектів. Нам важливо, щоб ви дійсно, ми попробуємо розіслати інформацію про ваш сайт, про ваш проект, тому що справді там може бути дуже багато речей, які відкривають оті горизонти, про які ми говорили. Дякую за таку інформацію і будемо очікувати якусь більш структуровану усвідомлення наше, де ми зможемо, кожна громада долучитися І дякую ще раз.
Thank you.
That's great. Yeah. Do people need like a short break before the next presentation, or we can go ahead directly?
І я думаю, що краще, щоб ми продовжили, бо ми все одно будемо або втратимо динаміку, або ми зараз розірвемо це сприйняття. Давайте рухатися далі. 2 години ми вже сильні, потужні, справимося.
Sure. Yeah. So go ahead. There's indeed one question I see from the chat from Alaska. How long it takes to rebuild the current? How long it takes to rebuild the current track on the European track, and how much it costs? Nick, do you have some thoughts on this? No.
I do. Yes, that's a very good question. And I mean, one of the major challenges that's facing Ukraine at the moment as it tries to reorient trade to the Western partners is this difference between the railway gauge in Romania and Poland versus in Ukraine. And unfortunately, it is quite expensive. There is no easy fix. But Ukraine does have some planning underway and has started to make some investments in connecting Lviv to the Western border using standard gauge railways. I'd be happy to share some more resources. There's kind of a lot of details to get into about that. But it can be quite expensive, but I think there's also a lot of funding available, as I mentioned, from European partners to support that work.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Я хочу сказати про те, що радянська система, вона має відійти, але самі колії сьогодні це є одною з частин нашої стійкості в Україні. Тому що залізничні колії сьогодні дають можливість працювати безпечніше і перевозити мільйони тонн вантажів, особливо військових і гуманітарних, для того, щоб зберігати стійкість. І я хочу сказати, що надзвичайно важливим моментом є навіть той факт, що всі державні діячі, які приїжджають в Україну, в Київ, вони їдуть потягом. Насправді ця система працює, і найцінніше зберегти